In the age of ancients, the world was unformed, shrouded by fog. A land of grey crags, arched trees, and everlasting dragons. Then, from the dark they came, and found the souls of lords within the flame. Seath the Scaleless betrayed his own, and the dragons were no more. Thus began the age of fire. But soon, the flames will fade, and only dark will remain. There has been a vicious cycle portrayed through Dark Souls, revolving around the linking of the flame, thus keeping Lord Gwyn's Age of Fire alive. But is that the cycle the world is meant to repeat, or is there another? What do we know of the beginning of the world in the Dark Souls universe? We don't really know too much. We know a little about the Age of Ancients, but does that necessarily mean the beginning of the world? The only thing we have to reference the beginning is the primordial serpents. Primordial meaning existing at or from the beginning of time. We know Frampt, friend to Lord Gwyn, who encouraged the linking of the fire. Then there is Koth, who advertises against linking it. These are the only two primordial serpents we know by name. But if we choose the dark ending in Dark Souls 1, we see that there are in fact more than just two primordial serpents. Though I would assume Frampt and Koth to be the leaders of their ideological affiliations. Good, bad, light, dark, life and death. Either one could represent each of these things, depending on whose side you take. So, by the look of things, time has gone, or intended to go, as follows. The Age of Ancients, the Age of Fire, the Age of Dark. But then what? A perpetual world of nothingness? No, I do not believe that to be the case. In fact, we can get a glimpse of the Age of Dark if we procure a certain set of eyes for the Firekeeper, which we can find in the untended graves. These eyes of a Firekeeper read, a pair of dark eyes, said to be the eyes of the first Firekeeper, and the light that was lost by all Firekeepers to come. It reveals to the sightless Firekeepers things that they should never see. This will again spark more debate on the very nature of the untended graves, whether it shows us the past, future, or a parallel dimension. Upon learning these eyes we find belonged to the very first Firekeeper, certainly will make us think of the past. Though, as we will hear more shortly, the dialogue we get from them speaks of the Age of Dark, which should be next in our timeline. So then we think future. Or for whatever reason, eyes from the past have seen the future. Or perhaps they were around long enough to see the Age of Dark in a prior cycle. There are a few pieces of dialogue we get from the Firekeeper after giving her the eyes that I would like to point out. She first says, "These will reveal, through a sliver of light, frightful images of betrayal. A world without fire. Ashen One, is this truly thy wish?" A world without fire would be considered the Age of Dark. which I've already mentioned the eyes bring vision of. But now, we are shown how to accomplish this by not linking the fire, which would seem like the obvious effect anyway. It is also considered to be a betrayal to not link the flame, but a betrayal of whom or what? This world? Its people? It is easy to connect light with good and dark with bad. But again, these things all rely on your affiliation with them. The Age of Dark isn't necessarily a bad or evil thing, and continuing to link the flame isn't necessarily a good thing. These things are both good and bad, righteous and evil, depending on which side of things you stand on. But like I said, without a complete understanding of events and their consequences, it is very easy to just assume that light stands for good. In most other things, it typically does. So, I think it has been burned into the minds of so many people who inhabit this land that linking the fire is a good thing, whether or not they know it could be potentially deterring the flow of time itself. That is why I think it is referenced as a betrayal. To further the proof that letting the flame die out by not linking it is a betrayal, here is another piece of dialogue from the firekeeper. She says, "Of course, I serve thee, and will do as thou bidst. This will be our private affair. No one else may know of this. Stay thy path, find lords to link the fire, and I will blindly tend to the flame until the day of thy grand betrayal." And the next bit of dialogue we get from her, after deciding on a world without fire. "Ashen One, forgive me if this soundeth strange. The eyes show a world without fire, a vast stretch of darkness. But 'tis different to what is seen when stripped of vision. In the far distance, I sense the presence of tiny flames, like precious embers left to us by past lords, linkers of the fire. Could this be what draws me to this strangely enticing darkness?" This was a pretty big selling point for me. So when the Age of Fire dissipates into the Age of Dark, in the future at some point, the presence of tiny flames appear. Flames left to us by past Lords of Cinder. It sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? The sudden appearance of flame in the dark, left by past lords. What is it Gwyn and the others found in their fire? Souls of lords. The emphasis on lords being multiple. Before, we really never got to know what a soul of lords was. Sure, we could read the description of Gwyn's lord soul, but he claimed that for his own, and it became his. So that really only gives us information about Gwyn. But at the end of Dark Souls 3, we actually finally get our hands on a soul of lords. So let's read the description for that. "Since Lord Gwyn, the first Lord of Cinder, many exalted lords have linked the first flame, and it is their very souls that have manifested themselves as defender of the flame. So, we learn that the soul of lords is basically just a combined soul of some of the people who have linked the flame. So what is different about this soul of Lord's than the souls of Gwyn, Nido, the Witch of Islith, and the furtive pygmy found? I don't believe there is anything different, besides us not fighting 3 more souls of Cinder, which would give us a total of 4 souls of Lords, like the amount found in the first flame. So, souls of Lords are just souls combined from the people who have perpetuated the Age of Fire by linking the flame. Upon ending the game by summoning the Firekeeper to let the flame finally die out, she speaks to us one final time. The first flame quickly fades. Darkness will shortly settle. But one day, tiny flames will dance across the darkness, like embers linked by Lords past. This is just something else that helps point me towards all these cycles being on a continuous loop. The flame will die out, and the Age of Dark begins, but eventually the tiny flames will reappear, and in it, again, are the souls of Lords from the ages past to be found. When we fight the Soul of Cinder, we can physically see a world that is on the brink of collapse. Everything looks to be being sucked into itself, like the world wishes to be reset, like the world will eventually become unformed once again, and perhaps unformed and shrouded by fog. It is hard to say how long into the Age of Darkness does it become the Age of Ancients again, and furthermore, how long after that until the Age of Fire. One thing we do know is that the Age of Fire begins when the ancient dragons are no more, because as the cinematic itself said, the dragons were no more, and thus began the Age of Fire, giving us the indicator that the prerequisite of an Age of Fire means no more ancient dragons. Though I don't believe having a straggler or 2 means that the ancient dragons are still a thing, because we do find presumably the last ancient dragon in Ash Lake. But just because he is one doesn't mean that the ancient dragons aren't no more. With that being said, does that mean that the start of the Age of Ancients brings with it dragons? It seems likely given the events that play out to usher in the Age of Fire. But where could these dragons come from? They couldn't just appear out of thin air, could they? We know there are certainly more than 2 primordial serpents, so who knows how large a number that could actually be. So I want to reference the covetous serpent rings from both Dark Souls 1 and 3. From 3 it says, a silver ring depicting a snake that could have been, but never was, a dragon. And from 1 it says, the serpent is an imperfect dragon and symbol of the undead. So, serpents could have been dragons. They are also imperfect dragons. And they are also the symbol of the undead. Which I think likely means the serpents are undead themselves. They are primordial and still alive after all. Could the reason they never became a dragon be because of the dawn of the Age of Fire? Perhaps that could be why Koth and the other serpents we see with him in Dark Souls 1 eagerly are awaiting the Age of Dark, because after that comes the Age of Ancients, in which they could perhaps properly ascend to dragons. Though, if that were the case, it begs the question of why would Frampt ally with Lord Gwyn and continue the tradition of linking the flame? Unfortunately, I don't really have an answer for that. I mainly wanted to focus on the idea and evidence of the continuous cycle of ages in the universe of Dark Souls. So, to sum up my theory, the Age of Ancients is the start. Eventually, there is a flame in the dark, containing the souls of lords from an unknown age of fire past. These souls of lords are acquired and made new, and the ancient dragons are struck down again, breathing life into a new age of fire. But as always, the flames will fade, and only dark will remain, bringing in the Age of Dark. But as we know, in the far distance, we will once again see the embers dancing, left to us from the Lords of Cinder, from the past Age of Fire. Wash, rinse, and repeat. The Angelic Faith, considered heresy in Lothric. But were angels always unwelcome there? Or did something sever the ties? Sleep well, and allow me to weave you a tale of angels, and how I believe All-Father Lloyd to be the figure behind their faith. We clearly see that the Winged Knights had a disagreement with Lothric, likely due to their faith being considered heresy, and the fact that the herald of their faith, Gertrude, was imprisoned high above in the Grand Archives. We learn this from two items. First, the Divine Pillars of Light miracle reads, "The Queen's holy maiden Gertrude was visited by an angel who revealed this tale to her. Despite losing both her sight and her voice, she was determined to record the tale. Ordinary men cannot decipher her fragmentary scrawl, nor comprehend how it became the foundation of the angelic faith of Lothric." And the Winged Knight armor reads, "Armor of the Winged Knights, who swore themselves to the angels." Worship of the divine messengers was viewed as heresy in Lothric, and unrecognized by any of the three pillars of rule. This is believed to be why Gertrude, the Heavenly Daughter, was imprisoned in the lofty cell of the Grand Archives. Furthermore, in the Dreg Heap, we encounter actual angels. Now, whether these are how the angels always looked, or are just a more grotesque version of such, doesn't really matter. What does matter is the connection of the angels to the Londor pilgrims. Even if the angel itself is defeated, it will reappear time after time. But we find several of these angelic larvae that have sprouted up from the Londor pilgrims, and are what are tethering the angels here, be it through prayer or any other means, which connects the angels to Londor, a land of hollows, notoriously wanting to usurp the flame and usher in the age of humanity. Now there are ties to the angels and the Lothric family, such as the feathers we see everywhere in Prince Lothric's room, and the association with Rosaria's man-grubs, casting feathered spells from their staves, and the lone man-grub near Gertrude's cage. But we can pinpoint a direction that the angels seemingly tend to lean towards. the dark. That's all well and good, but how does Allfather Lloyd fit into all of this? Well, let's start with what we know about Lloyd from Dark Souls 1. The white seance ring description reads, "A divine ring entrusted to the head bishop of the Way of White, and apostle to Allfather Lloyd, uncle to Lord Gwyn." The Way of White was a religion that was dedicated to preserving the Age of Fire. Its head bishop was an apostle to Allfather Lloyd, which likely means Lloyd was the founder of the Way of White, further evidenced by Lloyd's talisman and the cleric armor. The talisman's description reads, "Talisman utilized by Allfather Lloyd's cleric knights to hunt down the undead. In the outside world, the undead are accursed creatures, and Lloyd's cleric knights are widely praised for their undead hunts." And the armor reads, "Armor worn by the warrior clerics of the Way of White, who are famous for being unyielding in battle. It is rather substantial in size and weight, making its wearer look even bigger than he actually is." So these clerics of the Way of White are Lloyd's clerics, which to me make accepting that Allfather Lloyd, who founded and was worshipped by the Way of White, much easier to believe. Also, keep in mind the part from the cleric's armor which mentioned being substantial in size, making the wearer look bigger than he actually is, when you recall what the winged knight armor looks like. And finally, if you have any doubts that Lloyd was worshipped by the Way of White, we can read the description from Lloyd's sword or the shield ring from Dark Souls 3, which state, "Ring given to Knights of the Way of White, depicts Allfather Lloyd's shield of caste." Much time has passed since the worship of Lloyd was common in the Way of White. The clerics of Karim had always strongly asserted that Lloyd was a derivative fraud, and that the title of Allfather was self-proclaimed. So he was worshipped. But it seems that over however many countless millennia have passed since the founding of the Way of White in the time of Dark Souls 3, that has slipped away from Lloyd. Now, let's look at one more piece from Dark Souls 1 that I think helps connect Lloyd and this theory to what's happening in 3. The gold coin reads, "Coin made of gold, with Allfather Lloyd and his white halo shown on its face." The most interesting part is obviously the mention of Allfather Lloyd's halo, which, might I add, is very angelic, and is likely why the Way of White symbol is a white halo. Unfortunately, the textures used for this item make seeing what's on the coin very difficult. Suffice it to say, we'll just have to rely on what the description said. Now, by the time Dark Souls 3 takes place, the gold coin is still around, albeit a bit rusted, and its description has changed a bit, but I think it helps make sense of what happened to Lloyd. The rusted gold coin reads, "A rusty old gold coin that surely has no currency. A rich man lost his fortune, but it returned to him twenfold. He was swift to squander his retrieved fortune, smugly confident that it was bound to double once again. I believe this rich man to be Lloyd, and I think the losing his fortune is likely directed towards the decline in his worship through the Way of White, and the Karim clerics believing him a fraud. or his fortune being returned double-fold, is when he started the Way of White, and the squandering of it would be his decline in fortune, and then he would always be seen looking for a way to double it again. Also, an interesting point is that we can see the face of this coin quite well, and it very clearly depicts an angelic figure. So the ties to angels and Lloyd are already quite strong. But what does it mean? I think Lloyd was an angel, perhaps even the first. It could be why it was so easy for him to be worshipped by the Way of White, and why he held such influence. So we know Lloyd was associated with the Way of White, but how does that connect over to Lothric, and more importantly, Londor? Well, we know the Way of White was all about keeping the Age of Fire alive, and that is exactly the mindset that the Lothric family had. The cinders of Prince Lothric read, "The Lothric bloodline was obsessed with creating a worthy heir, and when this proved impossible, resorted to unspeakable means. Suffice it to say, the path to linking the fire is a cursed one indeed." So their ideals align with one another. Not to mention the deacons of the Cathedral of the Deep were originally with the Way of White. The Archdeacon Holy Garb reads, "Holy garb worn by an Archdeacon of the Cathedral of the Deep, a sign of the Way of White's highest rank." So the cathedral was originally Cathedral of the Way of White, until Aldrich and the deacons fell to the deep. So, Allfather Lloyd bringing the Way of White religion to Lothric doesn't seem unlikely. It even appears that Lothric was founded on this belief system, as they continually fight to provide an heir for the fire. This brings us to the statues we find around Lothric in the Grand Archives. They appear as a crowned older man with the wings of an angel. I believe these statues are Allfather Lloyd, and a tribute to him bringing his religion to Lothric as the foundation to essentially their way of life. In Lothric, we also find a hidden room guarded by a winged knight that houses a large painting of a winged knight, as well as a set of their armor and the sacred bloom shield, which reads, "A treasured antique of the Way of White, known to some as the Sorcerer's Bane." I think this furthers evidence that the angels and the Way of White were once the same. Another statue we can find in the game are statues at the Cathedral of the Deep, of what appears to be a humanoid going through some sort of metamorphosis into winged beings, likely depicting the relationship we see of Londor pilgrims, becoming the larva that controls the angels we see in the Dreg Heap. Perhaps this was something Allfather Lloyd had implemented into the Way of White, a way for his followers to turn themselves into these angels. Maybe those were the ones of whom Lloyd most trusted, his more dedicated following. Lloyd also did two other things with the Way of White from the beginning: the sanctioned undead hunts, as well as creating his own undead to send them on pilgrimage, like how we see with Rhea in Dark Souls 1. So Lloyd's trusty clerics were both executioners and pilgrims, not unlike what it appears that these winged knights are, with the description of the twin axes reading as paired beheading axes wielded by the winged knights who swore themselves to the angels. These axes, more befitting of an executioner than a knight, are indented to fit the human body, executioners with armor rather substantial in size, making its wearer appear larger than he really is. And of course the pilgrims from the Way of White back in the day, out seeking the rites of kindling, are similar to the pilgrims from Londor, who seek an age of man. But those are two opposite ideals. How could they have both come from Allfather Lloyd? Well, we know a little about how Lloyd is painted in some of the item descriptions we've read so far. That he could have been a fraud, squandering his fortune, looking out for only how to ascend himself back into worship and power. If the Way of White abandoned him, why would he not seek to attain the same level of worship elsewhere, and/or to enact his revenge? The Undead Hunter charm reads, used long ago by Lloyd's cleric knights on their undead hunts. Although Allfather Lloyd is long forgotten by the Way of White, his hunts have lived on. Again confirming Lloyd being forgotten by the Way of White. But it was also interesting to me how the Undead Hunter charm appeared. A rounded object, encompassed by what appears to be some sort of metal and chains fastened on either side. Perhaps to chain to something. Not completely unlike the objects we see chained to the backs of the Londor pilgrims, of which we know can become ascended in some relation to an angel. And so, in summary, Allfather Lloyd, an angel himself, founded the Way of White and reveled in the worship of those turning to his religion to keep their hopes of fire alive. But one day, he would be forgotten by the very faith he founded and labeled a fraud. In hopes of regaining adoration and power, he appeared in all his angelic grace to Gertrude, and thus the Angelic Faith was born, opposed to the very religion that turned their back on him. The painted world of Ariandel, and presumably Ariamis, and any paintings that may have come before, have long mirrored the outside world in many ways. The world within the paintings has cycles, just like the outside world. But instead of trembling at change, as Gwyn and the gods did, the denizens of the painting embrace it, for the sake of the world that comes next. In the outside world, the fire fades, but has long been continuously rekindled, so that the age of fire doesn't die. But within the painting, the fire expands to consume the world so it can be made anew. When we meet Slave Knight Gael in the cleansing chapel, which, as a side note, is actually an interesting name, as we can assume he is praying to the goddess Velka, as she is the mother of the forlorn, and it is called the cleansing chapel, similar to how the statue of Velka herself cleanses those afflicted with a curse. Gael asks us to show his lady, the painter, flame, so that it can burn the rot away, and she can create a new painted world. And while in Dark Souls 1, we didn't really get involved in the outcome of the painted world in such a way, it's important this time around, as we'll soon learn, that she intends to create a world with the Dark Soul itself. Gael also remarks that you have the same scent as that woman, in reference to Elfrida, since you're both technically unkindled ash. And I think it's important to go over Sister Frida for a moment. Dark Souls has never really been a game about good and evil. Sure, things can look that way through certain perspectives, but I don't think those who we perceive as the bad guys are always necessarily bad. Take Frida, for example. By the way we see it, she came into the painting world, convinced Father Ariandel to stifle the flame, and lords over it, not allowing things to change. Similar in a way to Gwyn, I suppose. Is that bad? Probably. Maybe from a lot of angles. But think about where Frida came from. One of the leaders of the Sable Church had dedicated her life to finding the Lord of Hollows and bringing on an Age of Man. She is an unkindled, which means she tried and failed to link the flame. Or probably more likely, she tried to wrest the flame from its mantle, as the Sable Church intended, and failed, further evidenced by the burns on her face. The whole ordeal of her failure was probably incredibly painful and embarrassing. Then the bells toll, and she finds herself back, scarred and haunted by her past, and the idea of having to return to it. And so she runs and runs, until she finds herself drawn into the painted world. Somewhere she's seemingly safe from the outside world. She convinces the father to hide the flame away, so now she doesn't have to worry about her responsibilities in the outside world, or about being burned alive again, since she basically outlawed the flame here. So again, was what she did bad? Maybe. But it seems apparent to say she didn't do it to be bad, or as some grand evil design. She, like a lot of characters in this world, are simply scarred and haunted by their pasts, and the fact that basically most things want you dead. So they do whatever they believe necessary to hide themselves from that torture and fear. And I know this was all a little off topic, but I've ruminated on that idea a lot lately, about there not necessarily being a good and evil in Dark Souls, and felt using an example of Sister Frida was at least in context with this video. Once we free the painter and defeat Frida, the world sets ablaze, and the painter waits for Gael to return to her with the pigment for her next world, the dark soul of man, of which she says will be a cold, dark, and very gentle place. This description, I believe, is indicative of the true haven of humanity it will be. Cold and dark seems to imply the absence of flame, the one thing that has dictated all of life since the beginning. And to live within a world free of it would be quite freeing indeed. But this only works if the world is created with the antithesis of flame, which would of course be the dark soul, or the darkness of humanity, which for too long has been shackled by the flame. So a cold, dark, and gentle place quite accurately describes the dark soul, right? Even Manus' soul that went wild is described as a gentle lump of humanity. So I can think of no better description for a world created specifically for those who hold pieces of the dark soul within them. And this was what was being fought for, and was worth being fought for. Gael was a slave knight, used in the war against the ancient dragons, and the slave knights have been around since the dawn of the Ringed City, has been under the oppression of fire for likely as long as he can remember. But he serves a new purpose now, to help create a world free of binding, probably even more so than a true age of darkness would be. So he sets out to bring the dark soul to his lady. But ultimately, we know he would fail, because we learn that the blood of the dark soul has long dried up and could never be used as a pigment for painting. That leaves Gael a singular choice: to consume the dark soul himself so that his blood can become the blood of the Dark Soul, though he knows he'll be corrupted by it. So he leads the unkindled one through the ringed city, knowing that they're the only one left that possesses the strength to kill him once he becomes uncontrollable and more powerful than ever. Then they meet at the ends of the world in time, atop a sea of ash, and the fate of the Dark Soul and humanity hangs in the balance. After the unkindled defeats Gael, they take the blood of the Dark Soul to the painter to create the next painted world, a truer home for humanity than ever before. But without Gael, all of this fails. Without his sacrifice, his knowledge of things that are and things that are to come, there would be no pigment, no new painting. Despite all that he had lived through, and perhaps all that he deserved, he made a sacrifice, not unlike Lord Gwyn, to make a better life for his people. But of course, in the context of our perspective of the world, Gael's sacrifice was for the better, while Gwyn's was for the worst. But all that begs is the endless debate of good and evil, and how it can continue to exist in that world. But it matters not, I think. Dark Souls becomes largely about the story of the individual and their journey and fight, not always for themselves, but for their families, their people, their religion, or the will of the individual. It's all about the collective tragedies of those who exist in this world. As the Pursuer's description says, the will feels envy, or perhaps love, and despite the inevitably trite and tragic ending, the will sees no alternative and is driven madly towards its target. In our travels as the unkindled ash, we meet Gundyr twice, once at the beginning of our journey, and later on in the past. After the bells toll and the unkindled ash rise from their grave, they are awaited by the former champion, now judge. Udix Gundyr bars the path to Firelink Shrine, the coiled sword binding him to measure the worth of the would-be chosen ash. The coiled sword that leaves Udix Gundyr impaled reads, "This sword is bequeathed to chosen ash, as judged by the Udix, who awaits the arrival of ash as a scabbard." This makes sense in the grand scheme of things, obviously. Much like the Asylum Demon in Dark Souls 1, the adherents of the Age of Fire needed a way to test the strength of their would-be saviors. But who was Gundyr before he became the scabbard, awaiting the judgment of ash? Well, we get a few clues if we push past the illusory wall. Just beyond the room we find former and consumed King Osiros. I'll warn you, however, the tale I gazed upon was one of betrayal and tragedy. Here, sometime in the past in the darkened shrine, we encounter Champion Gundyr. His soul reads, "Once a champion came late to the festivities and was greeted by a shrine without fire and a bell that would not toll." So we know that at least to start, Gundyr was meant to be the champion of the flame, the same degree of champion that he would one day preside over. But something wasn't right. The shrine was without fire, and the bells were silent. We get a bit more of the puzzle if we read the Estus ring, which is found within the tower of Firelink Shrine. where the bodies of firekeepers are placed for their eternal rest. The ring reads, "This ring was entrusted to a certain firekeeper, but in the end, she never met her champion, and the ensuing tragic farce became a favorite tale of the masses." This makes the most sense from what we know to be Champion Gundyr, who arrived late to the shrine to find nothing, including his firekeeper. Now, the idea of this tale being a farce is important. A farce is typically defined as a comedic or dramatic work, often using crude characterizations and improbable situations in the theater setting. But it can also mean a sham, travesty, or a pretense. I believe this pretense was set in motion by the Lothric royal family. The cinders of Prince Lothric read, "The Lothric bloodline was obsessed with creating a worthy heir, and when this proved impossible, resorted to unspeakable means. Suffice it to say, the path to linking the fire is a cursed one indeed." Now, we don't need to get into everything horrible that the Lothric bloodline did, but we know they were ruthless in their approach, and would even sacrifice their own family in the name of their flame and light. This also includes Gundyr, who I believe was a part of the Lothric royal family, possibly even the oldest son, that we know of anyway. The description of Gundyr's helmet reads, "Ancient helm of a set of cast iron armor belonging to Champion Gundyr, modeled after a former king. Gundyr, or the belated champion, was bested by an unknown warrior. He then became a sheath to a coiled sword, in hopes that someday the first flame would be linked once more." Now, some of this has to be taken with a little grain of salt. Most take the modeled after a former king part to be a direct reference to old King Doran in Demon Souls, and I get that connection 100%. FromSoft puts Easter eggs to their other games all the time, but they never tie the lore from separate franchises together like that. They're quite particular with their item descriptions. So I think modeled after a former king is a direct reference to a king that existed within Dark Souls itself. The only two figures labeled as former kings are the Nameless King and the Consumed King Osiros. We can visibly see that the Nameless King's armor doesn't look like Gundyr's, but Osiros is a pale drake now. So we're up shit creek if we wanted to know what he looked like before. But if I had to guess between the two, I'd probably say it's modeled after Osiros, especially if we're considering the idea that Gundyr was a part of his family, and sons modeling themselves after their fathers in Dark Souls is almost a theme. Also, we can look at the details of the armors of the other members of the royal family that we know of. Golden pieces and trim adorning and hanging from pieces of the armor, and the dark royal blue cloths being prominent in all sets. And of course the crowns worked into the helmet designs, which is exactly what we see going on with Gundyr's armor. It makes a lot of sense to me that Gundyr was a part of the Lothric bloodline, which makes it more tragic what his family did. You know, unspeakable means and such. So the farce, then, was the fact that the royal family was setting Gundyr up the whole time, filling his head with delusions of grandeur, how he would be the champion to the flame and save the world, etc., etc. But did they know all along they only wanted him as a pawn, to judge the one who would truly become their champion? Gundyr's halberd reads, halberd of Gundyr the champion, received when he was charged with his duty. This old cast-iron halberd has the power to break poise and is said to never crumble, seeming to suggest that Gundyr was fated to eternal service from the beginning. That description says a lot. Gundyr was always meant to play the role of judge from the start, but the farce was always that he truly believed himself a champion, betrayed by the very family he meant to sacrifice himself for anyway. We know that in the untended graves, he was bested by an unknown champion, likely the unkindled one, when we made our way through the area. Perhaps that was also part of the plan. With Gundyr defeated and weakened, it made him a prisoner, and slated him with what his true duty was all along. The prisoner's chain made from Gundyr's soul helps confirm this idea. It reads, "Portion of a steel chain used to restrain Gundyr. A prisoner is one who has staked everything on a belief, a proclivity most apparent in the greatest champions. His belief being the lies his family fed him from the start. Knowing that he was truly a champion in his own rights, and they would prey upon that very proclivity. Restrained, betrayed, and defeated, only then did they reveal the coiled blade they would pierce him with, damning him to his true duty. Only when the truest of champions arose and bested the judgment of this heartbroken Eudix would Gundyr rest. There is a grave in Lothric that sees no visitors, a dark place where rootless warriors rest. The Queen of Lothric alone cared to wish the poor souls good fortune. Perhaps you could call it shame, call it guilt, to visit the would-be resting place of the son she betrayed for a flame that would always continue to diminish, always just out of reach.